In January 1979, Daniel Bricklin and Bob Frankston write VisiCalc. Even at this early stage, they try to offer the program to Apple and Microsoft, who both turned down a deal for $1 million for the rights to this software. VisiCalc will continue in development and will be released in October. In May 1979, Apple manual writer Jeff Raskin refuses to work on a new $500 games machine, codenamed Annie, and instead writes a proposal for the PITS, or Person in the Street Computer. Also in May 1978, Atari programmers David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead met with the Atari CEO Ray Kazar to demand the company pay royalties and have their names on the game boxes. Kazar refused, and the once jolly atmosphere under Nolan Bushnell had begun to break down, and the key members of the software team were thinking about forming their own company. In June, Texas Instruments released the TI-99/4 for almost $1,200, which is over $3,000 today. It features a custom-designed TI-TMS-9900 CPU, which Texas Instruments introduced in June of 1976 as the very first 16-bit microprocessor, which ran 3 MHz, making it one of the fastest home CPUs of that time. It had 16K of RAM, 26K of ROM, which contained TI Basic. Programs could be loaded from a built-in cartridge port or optionally tape or disk drive, and the machine had support for the RS-232 serial and serial modem devices. It displayed 32 columns by 24 rows of text, and graphics could be produced in 256x192 pixel mode in 16 colours. Many TI-99s came with a 13-inch Zenith Color TV, which was slightly modified to appear like a monitor. Everything else had to be bought as extras, including a disk drive controller for $300 and an actual disk drive to use with the disk drive controller for another $500. A thermal printer seen on most modern buses to print tickets cost $400, and 32K of memory cost another $400, so by the time the user had upgraded to the maximum of 6 sidecar peripherals, they had spent the equivalent of $12,000 in today's currency. Texas Instruments had been introduced as Geophysical Services Inc. in 1930 and had delivered the world's first silicon transistor in January of 1954, and also patented Jack Kirby's world's first integrated circuit design in September of 1958. Jack Kirby's design used germanium as the semiconductive wafer, while 6 months later Robert Noyce of the Fairchild Semiconductor Corporation and later co-founder of Intel developed the world's first integrated circuit which used silicon. The original cheap pocket calculator was available by 1976 thanks to the TI-30 and its LED display. And after undercutting Commodore in this line for a number of years, they introduced the Texas Instruments Speak and Spell in 1978, which used the TMC-0280 speech synthesizer. Texas Instruments hoped that combining this technology with the TI-9900 CPU, they could fill the gap between the second generation consoles and the emerging home computer market. Unfortunately, production problems delayed the release until November, and despite re-releasing the machine in 1981 and spending $1 million on an ad campaign with Bill Cosby, they never sell more than 1,000 units per month, forcing the 5th largest semiconductor company in the world to drop its line of home computers by March of 1984. In June 1979, Atari Microcomputer Systems engineer Joe DeCure leaves the company to form his own company, Standard Technologies, which J. Minot was also involved with. In July 1979, Commodore began designing the VIC-20 and the cassette drive to go with it, ready to present at the June 1980 Consumer Electronics Show. After Jack Tramiel sees the success of VisiCalc, he immediately orders a machine to be made to buy into this market. Chuck Peddle and Bill Seiler start to design the TOI, the Other Intellect project, but the toy becomes too expensive and is cancelled due to the RAM costing too much money. At the same time, freshman engineer at Moss Technology, Robert Jans, has been working on his own computer design at home, which he called the MicroPet, which uses the same 6502 processor as the original Commodore PET, but with a much simpler design. The prototype is working thanks to the 1977 designers, Big2 engineer Al Carpentier and Charles Winterble, and after Jack Tramiel orders mass production of the prototype, Robert Russell takes over the project under the title of Vixen. The 5 Vic Commandos, as they were known, were inspired by the TI-99A machine and added 8 hardware sprites, and they also took collision detection from the still developing Intel Intellivision, and various functions from the Atari 800 were added as well. The eventual machine will be launched in Japan first as the VIC 1001 and will later become known as the VIC 20. On July the 30th, 1979, Apple officially launched the development of the Lisa computer, which was named after Steve Jobs' daughter Lisa. The Lisa was based on a brand new in-house CPU, which would use custom bit splice technology and would be designed by Steve Wozniak. Ken Rothmuller came in from neighbouring Hewlett-Packard to head up the development team, bringing with him hand-picked staff from Hewlett-Packard, which Steve Jobs immediately hated. In September 1979, Motorola introduces the 68000 16-bit microprocessor. It incorporates 68,000 transistors, giving it its name. The chip will go into full production straight away at the low price cost of around $40, and Motorola, now worth over $1 billion and based in Austin, Texas, say they will be ready to ship by the early part of next year. Jay Miner is among those at launch, very much excited about the 68,000. Apple immediately cancelled Wozniak's new CPU and pre-ordered a batch of the new M68Ks ready for its new line of prototype computers. In September 1979, Jeff Raskin begins work on the Apple Macintosh project, which is initially based on his PITS portable computer idea. In October 1979, Activision is created by a group of disgruntled former Atari programmers, and among the founders is Larry Kaplan. The Activision group approached Time Warner Interactive regarding the right to produce games for the VCS 2600, and Warner's agree, even though this was one of the reasons why they fired Nolan Bushnell. In October, the TRS-80 Model 2 is released by Radio Shack. The TRS-80 Model 2 carries its display in the same case unit as the floppy drive and the motherboard itself, with a separate keyboard with moulded corners similar to the VIC-20. Over at Apple, the Apple II gets a new lease of life thanks to the introduction of VisiCalc, the world's first spreadsheet and the world's first power application. VisiCalc also keeps sales at the Apple II going, bringing much needed funding into Apple. So they arranged for a version to be ported to the Apple SOS for the new Apple III project, and IBM also noticed the shift in the market for more serious business computers and started to design the IBM PC. Meanwhile, Apple Macintosh development head Jeff Raskin was trying to convince Steve Jobs that a visit to Xerox PARC might be just the ticket that the company needed. Jobs refused, and he disliked Raskin, so Jeff got his friend Bill Atkinson to talk Jobs into it. But Xerox had stopped giving tours at their labs, and so Steve had to make a deal where he would allow Xerox to invest $1 million in Apple in exchange for 2 guided tours for Jobs and his Lisa team. In November of 1979, Atari introduces the 400 and 800 computers for $495 US. This would be Atari's final 8-bit computer, although they did release the lighter cost-reduced XL and XE versions in 1983. Atari promised to share a huge bonus on the sales of these machines to the designers and the team at Grass Valley who worked on it, including the lead designer Jay Miner. The Atari 400, formerly known as Candy, houses an MOS 6502 processor clocked at 1.8 MHz and displays text in 40 column by 24 row text mode, a low-res 320x192 monochrome graphics mode, or an even lower-res 160x96 pixel display capable of 128 colours. The 400 came with 8K of RAM expandable to 48K and came with a top-loading cartridge port and an advanced child-proof pressure-sensitive white clean keyboard. The Atari 800 shipped at twice the price but had basically the exact same specifications. It had 4 internal expansion ports instead of 2 and 2 cartridge ports instead of 1. But the other difference was that it came with a full typewriter style keyboard. Both machines could load from a cassette drive or a disk drive and had expansion options for a printer, a modem and even a numeric keyboard. Combined sales for the Atari 8-bit family, also known as the A8 machines, would be around 2.5 million units in the US, with another 2 million units estimated around the world. In November of 1979, Steve Jobs visits Xerox PARC and is invited to see their latest breakthroughs in technology. Ignoring ARPANET, Steve instead gets the idea for the world's first commercial GUI interface, the Graphics User Interface, which was then known as a desktop metaphor. This early GUI was written using Smalltalk, an object-oriented, auto-debugging, reflective programming language, which was developed by a team led by Alan Kay at Xerox. Xerox had a company built upon photocopying and had no idea of the true value of their inventions. Atkinson is quickly convinced that the GUI will be the next big hit. So in December, sure enough, Bill Atkinson and Steve Jobs returned to Xerox for the second time, bringing with them several vice presidents and the heads of management. Xerox bosses are told again that this was like giving away their crown jewels, but order the tour to continue anyway. The Apple team immediately saw things which needed improvement in the desktop metaphor software and went away to begin designing what would become the System 1.0 operating environment for the Lisa and the Apple Macintosh. In February 1980, the IBM 5120 desktop PC is shipped to the public and credited into the public arena. The 5120 is the cheapest of IBM's range of computers at the time, at just $9,340, which is roughly $27,000 today. Like all its predecessors in the IBM range, the 5120 is an all-in-one unit, with everything built into a very solid casing structure, which weighed in at around 105 pounds, that's almost 48 kilograms, not including the printer. Also in February 1980, initial samples of the M68K were released to the public. The Motorola 68000 16-bit processor was attended amongst others by Jay Miner, who is amongst the first to receive one of the latest 8 MHz chips for testing. Jay goes away and sees the internal 32-bit architecture of the 68000 as a huge breakthrough, and the games machine running on such a system would be incredible. Overclocking the master clock on the motherboard to 28.636 MHz and dividing the number by 4 to run the CPU, the graphics coprocessor, the graphics display chip and a sound chip, all around 7.15909 MHz, which is the magic 7 MHz of the Amiga, and it would be possible to build a dream machine. So in April of 1980, Cyan engineer Jay Miner, having had nothing interesting to do since December when he completed the Atari 800 project, had become increasingly bored of the pokey antics of the clean TI-A chipset inside the 400 and 800 machines. Rather than incorporate the new 68,000 CPU into a system by further refining existing technology, he proposed to develop a brand new computer entirely. He spoke to executives at Atari, and Atari executives were initially wary of the extra finance involved with this, especially as the 400 and 800 systems had yet to make much money. So they asked Jay to go away to develop the idea on his own and come back to them when he had something completely designed. On May the 19th, 1980, during the National Computer Conference in Anaheim, California, Apple launched the Apple III computer with 128K of RAM and optional monitor, available for $4,500 to $8,000. Which is at least $12,000 today. Twice as fast as the Apple II and with twice as much memory with its amazing 128 kilobytes of RAM, it was also several times heavier than the Apple II at 26 pounds in weight, which is 11.8 kilograms, with most of its weight due to a gigantic single-piece aluminium shield to comply with strict regulations of that time. It came with a sophisticated operating system known as SOS and used the modded Cinetech 6502A CPU to deliver up to 2 MHz of raw power. Steve Jobs insisted that fans were too noisy for this new system, and as a result many of the systems without those fans overheated and suffered from warping issues. On the 1st of June 1980, the Sinclair Research ZX80 computer is released in the UK as a mail-order kit for £79 or pre-assembled for £99 and retails in the US for $199.95. There is a long waiting list of several months for the kit, initially announced in February of 1980, and it will be late in the year before orders are met. The ZX80 uses the Zilog Z80A CPU, which is clocked at 3.25 MHz and has a simple 32 column by 22 row character display text mode, and comes with 1 kilobyte of RAM expandable up to 64K. Weighing in at just 12 ounces, with no colour, with no sound and virtually no memory, this mini micro went on to sell 50,000 units before its successor, the ZX81, came along in March of 1981. In June 1980, the VIC-101, otherwise known as the VIC-20, debuts at the Summer Computer Electronics Show in Chicago. The Commodore VIC-101 is announced as the world's first colour computer, available for less than $300 and is sold in Japan's Saibu department store. The machine would later be rebranded as VIC-20 and sales to the rest of the world began in 1981. Also at the Summer CES in Chicago, Mattel Toys showed the Intellivision. The Intellivision is a second-generation console and ships in the fall of 1980 for $299, which is around $832 today. Engineering on the Intellivision video game system began in 1978 at Mattel Toys in Hawthorne, California, and although Europe and Japan would not get to see the Intellivision until 1982, the Intelligent Television was also marketed as the Sears Super Video Arcade, the Radio Shack Tandivision 1, and the GTE Sylvania Intellivision. When prices began to fall, the machine became a success, selling 3 million units globally, while production continued until January 1984 and earning Mattel Electronics a cool $100 million profit by 1982. The system used a 16-bit General Instrument CP1610 CPU running at 894.8 kHz. It had a 159 pixel wide by 96 pixel high display, which became 192 x 160 on a TV screen thanks to a TV scan doubling effect. It had a 16 colour palette and the huge 1456 bytes of RAM thanks to most of the logic being stored on hard-coded cartridge ROMs. The Intellivision was also the first device to support downloadable games thanks to a later Play Cable network which operated through cable TV. A keyboard expansion was announced which would also upgrade the console to 64 kilobytes of memory, but it never actually shipped officially, leaving customers with a product which quickly became outdated. In November 1980, whilst J. Miner is still working on his 16-bit computer design, which used the new Motorola 68000 CPU, 68K production chips are becoming available over the counter. Initial speed grades were 4, 6 and 8 MHz, with a 10 MHz chip becoming available during 1981. In December 1980, Apple incorporated a Motorola 68K into their Macintosh and Lisa Revision 2 prototypes, running at 8 MHz. The Macintosh project is now expressly under the control of Steve Jobs, having been kicked off the Lisa team over the summer, and who would often fly into rages with the constant delays and changes to the Mac. Apple also doubled the RAM of the Mac up to 128K. In December of 1980, the Atari 800 team are disappointed not to get a bonus promised to them the previous November, after Atari makes their computer department look barely profitable on paper to avoid paying the bonus. J. Miner thinks it is now or never and confronts management about his plans for a Motorola 68000 based computer. The management thinks it would be too costly to now invest in another computer after having spent so much money on the previous effort, and whilst they are still waiting for its substantial income from the Atari 400 and 800. Atari didn't want to invest again in an entirely new computer design when they already had a design which seemed solid and usable in the Atari 800 machine, so Jay was told no to his ideas, and in frustration Miner then quits Atari and moves to Zymos, where he designs medical chips for pacemakers which literally go on to save countless lives. In January 1981, at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, the Commodore VIC-20, already released as the VIC-1001 in Japan in 1980, was announced for $299 US. Pre-manufactured stocks of the VIC-20 are released in January and February, but huge demand means the machine is delayed as production tries to cope with orders, which are finally fulfilled in May. Jack Trammell told the engineers that they could only use 1K chips due to a surplus, which Commodore couldn't use in any other way. The VIC came with a 1 MHz MOS 6502 chip, with a 22x23 text mode display and 176x184 16 colour display pixel mode with 16K in ROM and 5K in RAM. 2K of which held the Commodore Basic version 2 operating system developed for the Commodore PET and later the Commodore Max machines, giving a total of 3.5K available system memory address to the user. Several memory expansion cartridges were later released and consumers bought the machines as fast as Commodore could make them, becoming the first computer to sell 1 million units by January of 1983, a few months ahead of Apple II's 1 millionth machine, and a drop in their retail price follows to become the first colour computer which retails under $100. Around 2.5 million Commodore VIC-20s are known to have been sold. In January 1981, MOS Technology Inc., Commodore's integrated circuit design subsidiary, integrated a project to design the graphics and audio chips for the next generation video game console, named the MOS Technology VIC-2, which will go on to become the heart of the Commodore 64. In February 1981, Commodore then began 2 new game console projects that would use the new chip. Robert Bob Russell, the system programmer and architect of the recently released VIC-20, and Robert Bob Jans, original producer of the Macro-PET prototype, proposed a continuation of the PET range aimed at businesses named the VIC-40. Jack Tramiel likes the idea but insists it must have 64K of memory, even though this alone costs over $100 at the time. He knew DRAM prices were falling according to Moore's law, so the VIC-40 became the VIC-64 and later the Commodore 64. At the same time, another project called the Ultimax or the Commodore Max machine began. It was engineered by Yash Terakura from Commodore Japan. It will use the same VIC-2 chipset as the new VIC-64, plus it will use the same MOS 6510 CPU, the same sound chip, and compatible ROM cartridge architecture, so that Max cartridges will work in other Commodore products. Moore's law states that the internals of integrated circuits will double in capacity and halve in price every 2 years, and this can be applied to CPUs, RAM, GPUs, and even the price and size of a hard drive. The term was coined in 1965 by Caltech graduate Gordon Earl Moore, who co-founded the Fairchild Semiconductor Corporation in 1957 and later founded NM Electronics, otherwise known as Intel Corporation, in 1968. Moore's law turned out to be very accurate and made low-cost computer solutions possible for the mass market. On the 5th of March 1981, the Sinclair ZX81 Issue 1 is launched by Sinclair Research in the UK. The machine houses the Zilog ZX81 processor. It features a revised keyboard and comes with a massive 1K of onboard memory, expandable up to 64K, but only 56K was actually usable by the machine. The ZX81 produced a monochrome display on any UHF TV with 32 column x 24 row text mode or 64 x 48 pixel graphics mode. More than 1.5 million ZX81 machines were sold until its discontinuation in 1984. In April 1981 at Apple, Steve Jobs envisages that the Macintosh will sell by the millions, so he negotiates an immense deal with Motorola to purchase the Motorola 68000 CPU for just $9 each, which is less than a quarter of the marketed price for the CPU at the time. In June 1981, the Osborne Computer Corporation produced the Osborne 1. It is considered to be the first true portable, fully featured computer by the fact that it is at least light enough to lift by one person. The Osborne 1 includes all the components required to be a completely usable and operational computer system, weighing in at 24 pounds, which is just 10.9 kilograms, and costing $1,795, which is almost $4,800 today. The Osborne 1 had a 5-inch display, 64 kilobytes of memory, a modem, and 2 5.25-inch floppy disk drives. A year later, after selling 11,000 units, Adam Osborne announced plans for the Osborne Executive or Osborne 2, along with a cut-price Vixen machine. Customers thought that they would be better to wait for the new models, and sales of the Osborne 1 dried up, forcing Osborne into financial collapse. This is commonly known as the Osborne effect, which Adam Osborne later admitted was an excuse he gave for the collapse of the company to the newspapers, but in truth the video games crash of 1983 and the approaching dominance of the IBM PC had a lot more to do with it. Also in June 1981, MOS Technologies start to build the VIC-2 graphics chip and start to work on the SID sound interface device chip, which will take 5 months, and had to be ready in time for completion of the C64 motherboard in November. Bobian's SID was inspired by the synthesizers at the time, and he wanted a sound chip as capable as the best synthesizer chips available on the market, to be used inside a computer for video games music. In July 1981, Atari reportedly lose $10 million on the sale of 10 million Atari 400 and 800 machines. Marketing strategy at Atari is called into question. On August the 12th, 1981, at a press conference held at the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom in New York City, IBM announced the IBM 5150 personal computer with a price tag of $1,565, which is around $4,119 today, although some machines would sell by retailers up to $3,000 when they shipped in September, which is almost $8,000 today. A brand new lightweight case design now hosted an 8088 CPU clocked at 4.77 MHz, 40K custom built-in ROM and 16K of RAM expandable up to a maximum of 256 kilobytes. This was a huge step forwards from the expensive and bulky 5120 released only 18 months earlier, especially considering an IBM computer in the 1960s often cost as much as $9 million and required an air-conditioned quarter-acre of space and a staff of 60 people just to keep it fully loaded with instructions. The 5150 case design was so popular that it became the de facto by which we still recognise some desktop PCs to this day, and certainly until tower units took over the market in the mid to late 1990s. It spawned hundreds of PC compatible clones and transformed IBM into an enormous global brand, which became known as Big Blue. The IBM 5150 was so popular that it continued in production all the way up until 1987, long after the PC XT and AT lines had appeared and took over the PC market. In November of 1981, MOS Technology's video interface chip Model 2 and the SID sound interface device for audio are completed. Work is still progressing on the VIC-64 and the Commodore Max machines. On December the 1st, 1981, in the UK, the BBC Micro Models A and B are launched. These low-cost 8-bit computers ran a standard 6502 with a system clocked at twice the CPU speed, alternating between the CPU and the video display with each cycle. The Model A came with 16K of RAM and Model B had 32 kilobytes available and retailed for £299 and £399 respectively. The project came about because of a computer literacy project operated by the British Broadcasting Corporation at the time, and 1.5 million BBC macros found their way into 85% of British schools and colleges thanks to this link with the BBC. The computers were only of limited educational use and had no way of producing colour high-resolution graphics until David Braben's Elite came out and showed Acornsoft how to do it. It was generally hated by school children everywhere, especially after the success of the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 in 1982, which really took the gaming market by storm. Acorn responded with a 32K Acorn Electron, which could produce medium resolution graphics with 4 or 2 colours or 16 colours in low resolution, but which was already out of date when it was released in August 1983. In 1982, the video games boom is at its height. The home video games industry is worth $3.8 billion and the arcade industry is worth $8 billion. By 1985, the industry is down to being worth just $100 million thanks to a massive video games crash. In January 1982, the Commodore Ultimax, also known as the Max machine, goes on sale in Japan for around $150. Commodore Japan engineer Yashitaro Kura had created a games console using almost all of the 64's design hardware ahead of the real Commodore 64's release in August of 1982. Despite boasting a VIC-2 with a 320x200 16-colour display, a SID chip and a MOS 6510 CPU running around 1 MHz, the Max originally had 4K of memory. The software team demanded at least 8K in order to have a fully bitmap screen, but Jack Trammell wanted to hold on to the RAM for the Commodore 64 project and instead offered a compromise of 6K. In the end, the unit sold with 2.5K, that's 2K for the RAM, and 0.5K for the video RAM, with no internal ROM, meaning everything had to be loaded from cartridge. 2 operating systems were released: the Mini Basic operating system, which left the user with just 510 bytes of programmable space and had no load or save feature, and Max Basic, which gave the programmer 2047 bytes of memory and a load and a save function. The machine was a massive flop, yet Commodore insisted all of their future machines must be backwards compatible with this device and its 22 game cartridges. The Max was announced for Europe, sometimes listed as the VC-10, but the project was closed within a year, and Commodore Japan, headed by Jack's son Sam Trammell, decided to hack the VIC-1001 machines and later hack the Commodore 64 to create unique Japanese versions. Around the same time, January 1982, at the Winter CES in Las Vegas, Commodore demonstrates a prototype of the Commodore 64. In January 1982, Redwood City-based Fortune Systems Corporation introduced the Fortune 3216 XP computer. It features a 6 MHz Motorola 68000 CPU and a daughter board with 256K of RAM. The Fortune runs the latest Unix version 7 and is the world's first true multitasking computer. It has high resolution graphics and different hard drive storage options, with prices also costing a fortune, starting around $5,000 US for a very basic model, and around $15,000, that's $32,000 today, for a top-end machine with 512 kilobytes of RAM. Fortune would expand the range with an SX series in August of 1985, where it still cost $13,000 for a 1 MB Fortune SX45. In February 1982, 3 senior managers from Texas Instruments, Rod Canyon, Jim Harris and Bill Murtaugh, designed an idea for a new computer on the back of a paper placemat in the Houston Pie shop. The name of the portable computer was the Compaq, a much lighter version of the Osborne 1, but with full IBM compatibility. IBM stood in the way of the Compaq company using their pre-operating system known as the BIOS, so the Compaq was designed by reverse engineering the IBM property and redesigning it as their own to perform the exact same functions. The Compaq Portable emerged in November of 1982, with shipping in March of 1983, with an Intel 8088 rated at 4.77 MHz, 1 to 8 kilobytes of RAM, and a tiny 80 column by 25 row monochrome text mode, and killed off any last hopes for the Osborne, which filed for bankruptcy 6 months later. First unveiled in March of 1982 and launched on the 21st of April 1982, Sinclair Research released the ZX Spectrum 16K and 48K computers, with either 16 kilobytes of RAM for £125, which was later reduced to £99, or 48K of RAM for £175, reduced later to £129. The Spectrum features a Zilog Z80 processor clocked at 3.5 MHz with an image resolution of 256x192 pixels in 15 colour plus black mode. Sinclair ran an ad campaign where a user could upgrade their 16K model for the latest 48K version, and customers can also buy a 32 kilobytes RAM expansion, which was made using faulty 64 kilobyte chips. with only half of their capacity being available. Around 60,000 Issue 1 ZX Spectrum computers are manufactured, with a second issue fixing a number of issues and presenting a darker blue-grey slate rubber-keyed keyboard. A Plus model appeared in 1984, which was the exact same machine inside a different case design, and a 128K version was eventually released in Spain in September 1985, featuring a 3-channel AY3-8912 sound chip, MIDI compatibility, an RS-232 serial and an RGB monitor port, and improved BASIC in an attempt to dodge attacks on Spanish computers with 64 kilobytes of RAM or less. The 128K Spectrum wasn't released to the rest of the world until January of 1986. In April 1982, Trip Hawkins leaves his role as Director of Strategy and Marketing on the Apple Lisa project, with an Apple II under his arm and several friends from the company, to found Amazin Software, or as it would become known, Electronic Arts. Trip wanted to credit the makers of the games and treat them like rock stars or artists, after Activision and new startup Broderbund had proved this successful. After working on a business plan for many months, Trip braved the Dragon's Den of venture capitalist Don Valentine, securing office space and funding. The company changed their name in October 1982 to Electronic Arts, borrowing on the name and the reputation of United Artists. By the end of the year, they had moved into a new company headquarters at 1820 Gateway Drive, San Mateo, California, where they produced and released the first game, Archon, in 1983. Around April of 1982, J. Miner receives a telephone call from Larry Kaplan, a former colleague who left Atari to create Activision. Larry is bored waiting for Atari to release the 5200 machine, and he wants to leave Activision and wants to know if Jay would be interested in developing a brand new simple computer with him. Jay immediately accepts and sketches out a rough design. They take the design to Jay's boss at Zymos, Burt Braddock, who helps them create a marketing and business plan to impress Zymos' main investor, a rich oil baron from Texas called O.W. Rollins. Over at Cyan Engineering in May of 1982, Atari's picture phones, a tab mouse pointer controller, a Dynabook briefcase computer, and Atari's ERIC point of purchase store kiosk machine are developed by Cyan Engineering. They also develop a simple laserdisc reading device for their ERIC point of purchase store machines. In May of 1982, the highly popular and successful game Yar's Revenge is released for the Atari 2600. Howard Scott Warshaw, the game's designer, got the names Yar and Razak by spelling Ray Kazar backwards, and the game saves Atari from financial ruin, and Warshaw becomes Atari's hottest property. Also in May of 1982, Sun Microsystems released the Sun 1 computer, a 10 MHz containing an M68K CPU, and Sun OS 0.9, along with Unix and 256 kilobytes of RAM, with a Sun MMU and true multitasking. The Sun was built by students at Stanford University and represents the future of the computing industry. It was inspired by the Alto but used far cheaper and smaller components, with Ethernet and UART 16-bit serial, and came as either a desktop or a rack mount machine. Later in May 1982, O.W. Rollins, owner of the Zymos Corporation, is very happy with the plan for a new computer. Rollins and 3 engineers had originally set up Zymos to fabricate and design IC chips, and who were funded primarily by Intermedics. The enormous cost of high-volume chip production forced the company to look for a way to use them beyond simple pacemakers, and they wanted to invest $7 million in the development of their own video games machine. Jay Miner would be vice president, designing the hardware and producing it at the Zymos Labs, and Larry Kaplan would be president and would coordinate the software which the machine would use. Somewhere before this time, J Miner is introduced to a military flight simulator at Simulink by his friend Al Pound. J gets to use the controls and experience the best flight simulator experience which money could buy. J wanted to bring the experience into the home, and using the power of the new Motorola 68K processor, it might just be possible. He found an article about blitters in a computer magazine, and this seemed to be a great way to move graphics around very quickly without interrupting the CPU, and would improve the smoothness of animations of flight simulators. From this meeting, Jay also thought it was important that games and flight simulators should have 4 independent channels of stereo sound. In June 1982, O.W. Rollins begins a nationwide search for a new president of the company he has just set up, and recruits Dave Morse from Tonka Toys in Minnesota. David Shannon Morse is recruited as Chief Executive Officer and leaves his role as Vice President of Marketing at Tonka Toys. Dave is well connected and starts looking after the investors involved with the Amiga. The investors and Dave Morse think the low-cost, heavily stripped-down version of the computer should be available purely for running games, and Jay agrees as long as a full-spec home computer version is available with lots of expandability. On July the 27th, 1982, Ray Kazar calls up Howard Scott Warshaw to commission him to develop E.T. Kazar informs him that Spielberg himself has asked for Warshaw specifically to develop the needed game, completed by September the 1st to meet with the Christmas schedule. Warshaw was offered apparently $200,000 and a trip to Hawaii if he could produce the game in that time, and Atari really needed to secure the $21 million they paid for the license. In August 1982, Commodore launches the Commodore 64, listed in the Guinness World Records as the highest selling single computer model of all time, officially selling over 17 million units, with units shipping in September. The Commodore 64, or the Commodore C64 as it was known, became a hit thanks to its 64 kilobytes of RAM, an unprecedented amount inside a hobbyist microcomputer at that time. This allowed the machine to run business-type applications and allowed Commodore to keep up with the big boys. Thanks to its 1 MHz 6510, its 320x200 display in 16 colours, and ever-increasing lowering price point, the C64 found its way into homes and offices everywhere. Users could even upgrade with a whole line of inflated priced peripherals such as a monitor, a printer and a disk drive, and still walk away with spare change from $1,000. The basic 64 went on sale for $595, which is still around $1,500 in today's money, but Commodore lowered the price to around $300 12 months later in June 1983. Third generation computers like the Commodore 64 with interface devices rather than cartridges are now superseding their second generation cartridge cousins. In August 1982, Coleco released the ColecoVision. This was a second generation ROM cartridge system using the Zilog Z80 processor at 3.58 MHz and also contained a Texas Instruments video processor, 16 kilobytes of video RAM, 1 kilobyte of main RAM, and everything else booting from an 8, 16, 24 or 32 kilobyte cartridge. Initially, the device had a copy protection system built into it, which companies like Parker Brothers and Activision bypassed in order to market games on the machine. 2 million ColecoVision units were sold before production stopped in 1985. In September 1982, Atari Corporate Research establishes a New York City research laboratory headed by Atari VP Research and Product Development Stephen T. Mayer, which will work in partnership with Warner Communications Inc. WCI to develop advanced products for the market. It will take another 8 months before the WCI NY lab is up to full speed. In September 1982, cardiologist investors at Zymos are still keen on a new computer, so Larry Kaplan and Jay Miner and Dave Morse choose High Toro as the company name because it sounded both high-tech and Texan to impress their backers, and move into Building 7, 3350 Scott Boulevard, Santa Clara, California, which is leased by Burt Braddock. The business plan was simple: to build a machine 10 years ahead of its time and then spend the next 10 years developing its successor. The company also planned to release Atari 2600 games under the US trade name of Amiga in order to fund development of their first new machine. Later that September 1982, after recently securing a financial deal which would kickstart their new venture, Dave Morse heavily suggested that they invite Nolan Bushnell in as part of the Amiga board. As they had both worked with Bushnell before at Atari, both Jay Miner and Larry Kaplan are interested in the idea, so Larry is asked to convince Nolan. Larry Kaplan then meets with Nolan Bushnell and then gets talked out of his ideas and gets talked into an idea working on a new computer with Nolan Bushnell instead. Larry Kaplan then leaves High Toro and Dave Morse becomes the new president of High Toro. Dave offers the full-time position of vice president and chief engineer to Jay Miner, who was still working part-time for Zymos at that time. Jay accepts to work on this full-time as long as he gets to build his computer his way. In October 1982, Larry Kaplan walks into Ray Kazar's office and talks about his ideas and dreams for a new computer. Kazar talks him out of the office and into the software department instead, and so the whole idea of a new Atari computer with Larry Kaplan vanishes and never happens. Back at High Toro in October of 1982, Amiga Corporation split their company into two divisions, a joystick and a peripherals section run by their third employee and new director of marketing, Don Riesinger, which would develop products for the existing console market. This would inhabit the first floor of their office space, and to all intents and purposes it would look like that this was going on. A second project was also started at this time, codenamed Lorraine, named after Dave Morse's wife, and the designers would begin designing a new 16-bit 4th generation computer. The ground floor offices of their building were then decorated with posters and low-cost consumer add-on products, whilst the basement was transformed into a secret set of underground workshop areas. Dave Morse then hired a group of marketeers and manufacturers to support the Atari peripheral division, whilst Jay Miner gets busy hiring a technical team to design the Lorraine, which will become the Amiga. Ronald H. Nicholson was a hardware engineer over at Apple Computers, working on the new Apple Macintosh project. Steve Jobs is handling the project personally and insists every part and detail should be manufactured in-house. He refuses to entertain any possibility of colour or sound being introduced into the Mac design, and insists that everything should be monochrome and mute, which deeply depresses Ron Nicholson, who has been thinking about ways to design audio and graphics chips. Jobs demands a new custom clock chip for the Apple Macintosh, so Ron goes to Cinetech, and the guys at Zymos gave him Jay Miner's phone number. After completing the clock chip for the Apple Mac 128 computer, Jay talks about his dreams for a colour computer over lunch. Ron is extremely enthusiastic about a new colour computer and is very keen to test his new ideas. So he promptly resigns from his job at Apple, and Ron becomes employee number 11 over at Amiga and becomes Jay Miner's first assistant designing the hardware as Director of Hardware Engineering. Another friend and system architect of the Atari 400/800 board, Joe DeCure, then joins the team from Standard Technologies, a design company he formed after leaving Atari, and becomes the third designer of the Amiga chipset. On the November the 19th, the three Amiga designers, Jay Miner, Ron Nicholson and Joe DeCure, meet to plan the new computer. Together, the three amigos design almost the whole computer, except for a few details, before they go about employing the staff to build the machine. In December 1982, Dave Morse and Jay Miner changed the name of the company to Amiga Corporation or Amiga Corp because the name High Toro was already taken by the huge lawnmower manufacturer Toro. They decided they didn't want to use letters or numbers in their name, as this might lead them to be associated as a computer company. First, because they might give away the fact that they were building a secret computer, and second, because they might want to change their merchandise and sell other things in the future, like kettles and toasters and that kind of thing. Jay Miner was also handy with digital calculators and wristwatches. They also wanted the company name to start with the letter A in order to appear before Atari in the telephone book and the yellow pages of that time. Apple was still a fledgling company compared to the mighty Atari and IBM. The name Amiga was chosen because it was Spanish Portuguese for girlfriend, and it had a nice sounding unique name with two A's, which made it sound exciting and going places. The name was placed into italics to emphasize this movement. In December 1982, E.T. the Extraterrestrial Adventure video game published by Atari Inc. for the Atari 2600 is published. It was designed by Howard Scott Warshaw, and 6 weeks later it causes an unsettling in the video game home consumer market after many buyers return their cartridges and demand their money back. This is the first sign that the video games industry, now worth billions, is now about to implode. In January 1983, between the 6th and the 9th, at the January CES, Commodore announces the B128 and the P128 computer range. The P128 was a business computer to take over from the Commodore PET and was part of the CBM2 project. It came with an 80-column green screen display, a 6509 CPU running at 2 MHz, and 128K of RAM. The B128 had a 40-column display, 128K, with no VDU, and both models sported a very smooth case which was initially designed by Porsche Design, a company run by Ferdinand Porsche's son, and the Porsche PET cases were completed by Ira Valinsky. The P128 was subsequently cancelled, and a few pre-production models they produced were mostly recalled and destroyed. The B128 idea developed over the next few years and was released in Europe as the CBM 610. At the CES, Commodore also demonstrated the HHC4 handheld computer featuring a 6502 processor, 24 character x 1 row LCD display, and 4 kilobytes of RAM expandable to 16K for only $199. Jack Tramiel was initially hopeful that the programmable calculator market would stand another late-to-the-market contender, having developed from the Texas Instruments TI-55 programmable calculator released in 1977 to the Panasonic, otherwise known as the Quasar H1400 HHC handheld computer introduced in 1982. The Commodore HHC4 didn't gain significant interest and was cancelled. Also in January 1983, the Atari 1200 XL is presented at the Winter CES. The 1200 XL notably features 64 kilobytes of RAM, a built-in self-test mode, and a redesigned keyboard featuring 4 function keys and a help key, and a redesigned cable port layout. It was shipped in March, costing $899, which is still over $2,000 today. Part of its design was based on the Sweet 8 project, also known as Liz NY, created in Warner's WCI NY Atari Labs run by Stephen Mayer, who was one of the founders of the Atari think tank Cyan Engineering. The Liz computer was then modified into the 1200 XL after some of its features were cancelled, and this was introduced as a replacement to the Atari 800 in later 1983. On the 19th of January 1983, the Lisa PC is introduced by Apple Computer Incorporated. Lisa features a Motorola M68000 processor, clocked at 5 MHz, a built-in 12-inch monochrome monitor displaying a 720x364 graphic display, 1 whole megabyte of RAM, twin 5¼ floppy drives, all for $10,000, with an optional Profile HD hard drive controller for just $3,499 for 5 megabytes. The hard drive and computing combo costing around $32,500 today. By now, the Apple II had become a universally popular machine, and Apple were worth $8 per share, with an annual revenue of around $1 billion. Customers of the Lisa were at first enthusiastic to see a new Apple computer, which was an early attempt to copy the Xerox Alto and Xerox's own portable Alto, the Xerox 820 aka the Worm, which appeared in 1981 for just $3,000. Sales of the Lisa proved disappointing, and the project was cancelled within the year. In January 1983, Commodore offered a $100 cashback in the United States for the purchase of a Commodore 64 to anyone that wants to trade in another video game console or computer. Thousands of consumers trade their old computers and consoles in, putting the likes of Timex, who at the time are marketing their own version of the ZX81, the Timex Sinclair 1000, totally out of business within a year. This sparked a price war in an already shaky consumer market, and this increased fears that consumers did not know which technology to trust, and greatly added to the looming video games market crash of 1983. Between January and October 1983, Amiga Corporation recruited new members to work on the Lorraine prototype. These include Tom Cahill as lead lab technician, Glenn Keller is in charge of the audio chip, and systems engineer Dave Needle, who worked on the Agnes and the systems boards. Ron Nicholson's friends from BTI Computer Systems, Dave Dean and Bob Pariseau, joined as systems engineers, and later Carl Sassenrath, a calculator designer from Hewlett-Packard, Sam Dicker, an audio engineer from Williams Electronics, and later R.J. Michael from Williams, and in August, systems engineer Dale Luck is hired by the team, and in October the final hirings include Bob Burns, a specialist software engineer who ends up working on printers and input devices, and Bob Peck, a specialist in writing computer manuals.